Welcome to the Miscarriage Hope Desk Podcast, where we help women struggling with recurrent pregnancy loss by sharing stories of hope and interviews with experts in the field of fertility and miscarriage. If you want to download our free lab checklist, go to miscarriagehopedesk.com/labs. Again, you will go to miscarriagehopedesk.com/LABS to download your free checklist. If you want to connect with others going through recurrent miscarriage, please check out our show notes for a link to our Facebook group. Now I'm going to hand it over to your host, Laura Bowder, for today's episode.
Welcome back to the Miscarriage Hope Desk Podcast. Today we have Kim Hooper with us, and she is the co-author of All the Love, Healing Your Heart and Finding Meaning After Pregnancy Loss. And you heard us talk a little bit about this book in the interview that I did with Dr. Hong Depp. And she is actually going to be joining in for a little bit on this episode too, so she and Kim can talk about the book together. But first I want to say hello to Kim, and thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited, really supportive of your show.
Thank you so much. So let's start off with letting the listeners into a little bit of your story and your personal experience with pregnancy loss.
Yeah, so I've had quite the journey to motherhood. My first pregnancy loss was an ectopic pregnancy in 2015. I had my fallopian tube removed. It was an emergency surgery type situation, really traumatic for me. I kind of thought, I'd paid my dues after that loss, and thought my next one will be successful. Unfortunately, that was not the case. I had a miscarriage for my second pregnancy. My third one got all the way to the second trimester. And then we found out my son's heart had stopped at 17 weeks. So I had a D&E. I still kind of regret not delivering him and holding him, but I had a D&E for that one. I still felt like I had to try again. I kind of kept thinking of that infamous definition of insanity where, you're kind of crazy at some point to keep trying, but I just felt like I had to. We were kind of rejected by fertility specialists for IVF because I was told my eggs were so bad. I was told I would never have a child of my own.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So we were kind of given no choice but to keep trying on our own. My fourth pregnancy was again ectopic, but which I guess is super rare to have two, especially because I'd had the tube removed. They couldn't find where that embryo had implanted. So I had medical management with that one with methotrexate injections, and took a long time to kind of be officially not pregnant anymore. So I don't know why I kept trying, but I got pregnant a fifth time, and that pregnancy was textbook. And I gave birth to my daughter in October 2017. She was right on time. There were no issues. She's totally healthy. And I feel like just defied a lot of odds and defied a lot of doctors and what they told me. But it was a couple years of intense grief and knowing Hong. I mean, Hong and I have been friends for 20 years almost. We're going to celebrate our 20-year friend anniversary soon. And she's always a great resource in my life for kind of just, she understands human emotion and the human brain so well. And she was just a comfort to me during that time. And also just as I've processed my grief in the years to come. So, I mean, even after having my daughter, there's still things that I feel like I'm processing, and she's really helped me to do that. So when I felt ready to write this book, I knew I wanted her to be a part of it. I kind of felt like we needed a really strong psychological voice as somebody who works with clients on a routine basis and really knows so much about psychology and grief and trauma. And I also felt like I didn't know enough about the LGBTQ community and intersectionality. She kind of opened my eyes to that concept and how different race and social status and economics all intersect with the grief of pregnancy loss and kind of can either complicate it or compound it. So she really opened my eyes to that and was a great voice for that in the book. So that's kind of how we came together. And she's one of my very best friends. So I'm lucky to have her.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I know from talking to her that you guys kind of describe the book as like part memoir, part therapy session. So I think it's a really, really great resource, because when you're going through a pregnancy loss, you need both of those things, right? You need someone
Yeah.
who you can just go and talk to and they'll be like, yep, totally get it. I know what you're experiencing. And then you also need some of that, like, how do I actually take the steps to move through this? So if you guys want to share a little bit about maybe how you intertwined those together so that, so
Yeah.
the listeners can kind of understand what that took to bring both of those
Yeah.
pieces together in one book.
And Hong can kind of talk to some of the conversational ness of the writing that way. But we did intentionally do that, in that I'd read a lot of memoirs going through my loss, and they were very good in terms of making me feel less alone with not just my grief, but with all the things that go along with grief. So, the anger at my husband, the anger at pregnant women, like going through all this stuff. It was nice to read memoirs, but I also felt like I was missing that kind of therapist on my shoulder who could help me make sense of my experience. So I wanted the book to kind of feel like a conversation where I could share my personal experience, and then have my co-authors, Meredith is a social worker and Hong is a psychologist, kind of comment on my personal experience. So for us as friends too, it was kind of nice because I think she could read some of the in-depth stuff about my personal experience that I could put down, and then she can kind of respond to that, and it feels almost like a therapy session on paper. So I don't know, Hong, if you felt that way, kind of seeing my inner thoughts and then being able to respond to them. But
yeah, and it's definitely a love fest between Kim and I, and I'm just so grateful that she asked me to join in. And that, yeah, even Kim, I think we've talked about this, but that even reading through your words, I mean, these years later, it definitely, there were still experiences that I didn't know that you had gone through, and because I think at that time I was in a different space in my life as well, and I think too that I must admit, given that I haven't experienced a pregnancy loss, that there were times, I don't think I said any of the things that one shouldn't say, to someone who has experienced a pregnancy loss. But definitely, I felt, even as a mental health therapist and as one of your good friends, I felt like there are times where I'm like, oh God, I don't want to say the wrong thing. So I think for me, I could have a lot of empathy to people as to why sometimes there's that silence. Right. And so I think for me too, and I think I was very explicit in the book to be like, hey, like I haven't experienced, a pregnancy loss myself to my knowledge, but here's what I know from, my research and my clinical experiences and, just being part of, the human race. Right. And so I think, yeah, it was, for me, it was very healing too, to be able to kind of 5 years or whatever many years later it is now, after your first pregnancy loss, to really go back and I think be able to, again, clearly I'm not your therapist, but to kind of share in some of those times with you, and to process together, and also to have the space to kind of amplify voices from some of the communities that I work with.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Hong always enlightens me, I just have to say.
Yeah, well, I think it's important to, when you're writing this book that speaks to such a it's a really, what is it, like, poignant experience, but it's something that if you've experienced it, there's nothing else quite like it. But it's also a very individualized experience too. And so I think having like the conversation that Hong and I had in the previous interview about just like thinking about all the different things that can come into play, that if you're writing your own memoir, you're not focused on some of those other experiences. So to be able to reach out to a wide audience and say, look, like, I understand what you're going through. I've had this experience, but let's also talk about like some of the other things that may be outside my personal experience that are still really impacting you as well.
Yes. Definitely. That we want this book to be really welcoming to anyone who has been touched by this experience, partners, friends, family. And we realize that there's such a variety of experience. Even two people that have the same type of physical loss can have a completely different emotional experience of it. So we definitely try to give attention to that.
Yeah, and I wanted to share too that I think that part therapy piece of the book, which I think makes it really different, is that we do know that unfortunately in this day and age that access to therapy is still very limited for some communities. I mean, telehealth right now has definitely increased access a little bit, but there's still potentially the financial barriers and the barriers for finding a provider, like we talked about earlier, Laura, of like that has the understanding, right, of these different intersections and stuff like that. And so I think for me, as somebody from a social justice lens of being like, oh, well, here's maybe one way to just bring a little bit of some basic psychoeducation, about therapy and about validating like trauma and emotions and experiences, in a way, in a non-jargony way, right? Kind of in that more conversational way. Because I think as those who know me know that I'm not a scary, therapist that, speaks, from my high horse or anything like that. But unfortunately, there is still that stigma, right, of feeling afraid of going to talk to a therapist and then getting further stigmatized or, being told that, what they're feeling or what they're experiencing is wrong. So I think for me, that's always been a passion of mine, is just to really reduce the mental health stigma. And that Kim and I are both very pro therapy. So.
Oh yeah. Therapy for life.
Yes, I can echo that as well. So something that we were talking about toward the end of the previous interview was really working through loss with a partner. And Kim, I know you have a lot to share about that experience as well. Connecting with your partner again after a loss and after recurrent losses, like that, it really builds up into an experience that can be very difficult.
Yeah. And I think I was not prepared for that part. We actually dedicate a whole section in the book to connecting with your partner after a loss, because in talking to other people who have been through this, it really puts such a strain on their relationship. And I think a lot of people came out saying that their relationship was stronger, but I think it's not immediately stronger. I think it's strengthened by the weaknesses that can come out in the wake of the loss. In retrospect, I mean, at the time, I hated my husband. I so resented his ability to just kind of go through the motions. He was very much like, we need to move on. He was, didn't appear to be really emotionally bogged down in the way that I felt. And even sometimes seem irritated with my emotionality over it. At the time, that just made me mad. In hindsight, and we went to couples therapy, we went to like a grief therapist together. And I think I learned that he was grieving in a completely different way. And for your listeners or for you, it might be common knowledge that we grieve differently. I had no idea. Like I thought, well, I'm grieving the right way. Like I thought I am doing it the right way. I am devastated. I'm crying. I'm depressed. I don't want to go out and do things. Like, this is the way you grieve. My husband, who is, busy going on 100-mile bike rides and working on house projects. I joke that one time I found him cleaning the cement outside. I didn't realize that is avoidance is a way of grieving, that it's an escape from, I think, the feelings that are too difficult. And we were eventually able to have conversations. And one of the things that stuck out to me is he said, "You've just always been my rock. So to see you falling apart in this way is just extremely unsettling." Like, yeah. I think it was just so hard for him to come to terms with me being in that place. And his greatest fear, where my fear was, I'm going to keep losing babies, I'm never going to be a mother. He was like, I've lost my wife. So, learning to have compassion for that. And I think we really try in the book to speak to that. There's actually parts where I write an entry and then I have my husband comment on it. So I kind of interviewed him and he puts in his responses to what he was going through. because I frankly was not considering what he was going through. I was only thinking of my own emotional and physical self, and I felt like a train wreck, and that's all I cared about. So it took a lot of time. And I feel like it's still lessons we learn of just the ways we're different. And there is no real right or wrong way to grieve. And it's very, very common for couples to grieve differently. There's studies that show that couples who go through a miscarriage are 22% more likely to break up to 3 years after the loss. So it can have that kind of long-term effect. And if it's a stillbirth, the percentage is even higher. So that doesn't surprise me because like I said, it's just such a paradigm shift. A loss like this is just so shattering. So, but I do think it's possible for couples to come back together. And a lot of it is compassion and empathy for each other's ways of grieving.
Right. But I think what you said is right on, because we think that the way we grieve is the way that everybody should grieve. And if they're not grieving that way, well, they just must not be as upset as we are. And so I can totally see how, like, even years later, like you were saying, like, it's just kind of this wedge that, over time, just a little bit more and a little bit more. And, I think as couples, we can kind of see each other as extensions of ourselves at times. And so it can be really unsettling to see the other half of the couple break down. It can be really unsettling to feel like you don't feel what I'm feeling, even though we're going through this together. So on both sides of that, it can be really difficult if you don't have that kind of support. A lot of time, I think, as we just said, I recommend through counseling, couples therapy, something like that. But at the very least, through just sitting down and having a conversation and really understanding where the other person is coming from, looking through a book like yours would be great, where you can kind of see lots of different perspectives.
Yeah. And I do think we're kind of socialized to see our partner as everything, that we're supposed to be exactly on the same page. We have this idea of soulmate and best friend and all of that. And I kind of needed to get support elsewhere, whether it was through therapy or friends or family members who I felt like could more emotionally connect with me when my husband was not able to do that during our losses. And I had to convince myself, like, that doesn't mean our marriage is bad. It's a good thing to get support in places besides your spouse or your partner. So I do think we're kind of socialized to think that our partner is always, that we're linked sometimes in heart and mind. And it's just not always true. Even if we spend day in and day out together, we can do things very differently. So it was a learning curve for me.
With certain losses too, if you have an earlier loss, or you just, you haven't told many other people about the pregnancy, like, you and your partner can really kind of be in that by yourself and then try to figure out, like, do we tell people that this is what we're going through? Do we not? Like, how do we handle that? So if nobody else really knows about it, then you might want to seek support from someone else. But first you have to tell them that you were pregnant and now you're not pregnant.
And that can be overwhelming. Yes. Yeah. I remember
I want to tell anybody else about that. I just keep it between the two of us.
Yep. I remember after my first loss, when we got pregnant the second time, I kept a list in the notes app of my phone of people I had told about the pregnancy, because I was like, those are the people I can go to if something goes wrong again. And I didn't want to, I just kind of felt like I needed to have a little group of people who knew. When we lost that pregnancy, I just showed my husband the list and I was like, can you tell them what happened? I'm not up for it yet. I just had to kind of like segment out things like that, like, because it is hard, like, who knows and who doesn't know, and who's going to be able to support you and who's not. And it can kind of change friendships too, because I just knew certain people were not going to be able to be there. They were the ones who were like, well, let me know when you're up for a happy hour. And it's like, I'm not, like, I want somebody who wants to just hear my story, like, not necessarily just rush past it. So it can make you feel lonely. It's definitely a lonely experience.
It is, for sure. And so, like, with when my husband and I experienced our miscarriage, like, it was pretty early on in the pregnancy. We hadn't announced it to anybody. And once we were announcing our second pregnancy with our son, who is, here Earthside now, I made sure to tell everybody, like, this isn't my first pregnancy. This is my second pregnancy. We've experienced a miscarriage, because I wanted other people to know that if they either had already experienced one, or if they experience one in the future, that I was somebody that they could come to, and I would understand what they were going through.
Yeah, I kind of did the same thing. I mean, I followed the rule with my first pregnancy of don't tell anyone. And then I kind of felt like, why are we all doing this? Like, because then if something goes wrong, you have no support. I mean, you have nobody who really was on the journey with you. Right. So, and I do make a point. I'm very open about my losses. I feel like I just sprinkle it into lots of conversations, mostly because I want people, if someone happens to hear and they're like, oh, she might, understand or relate, it kind of makes me feel like at least I can be a listening ear.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I know part of what you talk about too is that, so once you experience a loss, there's all of that, there's so many emotions, all of the anxiety and fear that you experience. And even if you have a healthy baby, as you and I both have now, like, we know that that doesn't just go away. It doesn't erase all of the experiences that we've had before. It doesn't, get rid of all of that anxiety and that fear.
Yeah.
So yeah, can you talk a little bit about that piece of it, and what that looks like for, someone who's moved forward and maybe has a healthy pregnancy, a healthy baby?
Yeah. I mean, and we have sections in the book about pregnancy after loss and managing the pregnancy itself. And then, motherhood after loss, because I do think it changes you as a mother too. I see life as so fragile. And I feel like it's a good thing in that it's made me really grateful for everyday moments with my daughter. But I do always kind of have this lingering anxiety and fear, knowing how things can just change in a moment. I do feel like I think more than other people would if something happens to her, or I do have that kind of ongoing anxiety that I have to manage and that I have to kind of be aware of, and have some compassion for myself for why it's there. But I think it changes the way you mother. I mean, it changes, for me at least, I think I'm a more patient mom, on the positive side, more patient, more compassionate, more able to kind of really appreciate moments. I mean, trust me, I have my times when I'm still a human being and I get frustrated and all of that. But I do think it's had positive effects, but there is that lingering anxiety that I'm not sure, I'm sure all parents have it to some extent, but I think when you've had a loss and you've kind of seen the dark side, it's hard to just forget that. You're changed as a person when you go through a loss that, is traumatic. So I think it's just integrating it into who you are and trying to find, peace in it and in what has happened. So
yeah, I mean, I think pregnancy and parenting after a loss is, like you said, like, I'm sure all parents have times where they worry about their children, and we always want the best for our kids, but yeah, I can imagine that it just feels different if you've never experienced the loss of a pregnancy, the loss of a baby. It just hits a little different. So I think that's absolutely
agree.
right. So
agree.
What would be your biggest piece of advice for a woman or a couple who is experiencing recurrent pregnancy loss?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like you have to really trust your gut on, are you ready to try again? Do you want to try again? What are your medical options? But know that, like, science is great and doctors are great. And I've said this to a few different people. Science is great. It doesn't know everything. I mean, I was given such a low probability of success based on numbers with my egg quality and, quantity and everything. And it makes no sense that I was even getting pregnant. It doesn't make sense on paper. And it doesn't make sense that I have my daughter. So I think sometimes you just have to really trust your gut, get the scientific information that you need to get to feel kind of empowered and confident to make your next move. But also just know that there's something bigger than you that is not always understandable, that you kind of have to know in your own heart what you're ready to do in terms of trying again or not. I mean, it's such an intuitive, personal thing to each person. So we have a section in the book on deciding not to try again. There's, frankly, when my daughter was born, I had my husband get a vasectomy because I was like, I cannot go through. I'm so grateful she's here. I feel like we won the lottery. I have no interest in pressing my luck. I just can't believe this happened. I don't want to go. I cannot go through a loss or a series of losses again. So I made that definitive choice for myself, and it felt very empowering to make that choice. And then we have, sections in the book about deciding to try again if you're not on the same page, like maybe one half of the couple does not want to because of all you've been through. There's obviously a variety of medical tests and fertility specialists, and it can all be very emotionally draining. And financially draining. So I feel like it's really up to each couple to kind of figure out next steps. Recurrent pregnancy loss is a special kind of hell. It's awful. I mean, I think the grief can get compounded from one step to the next, and you really just have to know in your heart what you can deal with and what you can't, and what there's different paths to motherhood if that's what you want. Or you can decide not to try again, and that is perfectly fine. There is not like a right or wrong, I think, decision. So that would be, I guess, my advice in a roundabout way.
No, I think that's exactly right. I think it's such a personal decision. It has to feel right to you and your partner, and it has to be something that, you make that choice. And there are certain things where you can decide to change your mind, vasectomy, maybe not as much, but
yeah. I mean, it's also personal to you, and you can't care what other people think. I think when I kept trying, I think people thought I was foolish. I mean, I think some of my friends were like, oh my gosh, she keeps banging her head against the same wall. Like, why is she doing this? And I honestly couldn't tell you why. I just felt like, I keep getting pregnant. It's going to happen. Like, I just felt that. But yeah, it didn't make logical sense. So, I think you just have to really kind of key into yourself and really listen to your own inner voice. People are going to question you. Doctors might question you or tell you things that are really disheartening. Get all the facts you can, but then just trust your gut.
Yeah, no, I think that's really good advice. So when we release this episode, your book will already be out in the world. So that's very exciting. Tell us a little bit about how the listeners can connect with you online, where they can find out more about you and get the book.
Yeah. So the books were available wherever books are sold. So you can do the Amazon thing or the bookshop thing, whatever is your jam. We have a website, alltheloveafterloss.com. And I don't know if we really even talked about where we got the title. So grief and love, we kind of see as two sides of the same coin. So to me, grief is kind of an expression of the love you carried for the baby you lost. So the reason it hurts so much is because of that attachment and because of, all that baby represented in your life. So I think we kind of focus on the love that is still there after the grief and or with the grief at the same time. And kind of, there was a quote like, grief is love with no place to go. So we kind of, I think in the book, want to figure out, well, the love can go to yourself. The love can go within. There's a lot of good and happy, feelings that you can get from yourself that I think we're trying to cultivate. So we really focus on the love. But alltheloveafterloss.com is the website. We're on Twitter and Instagram at allthelovetalk. We're just hoping the people who need this find this book and have some comfort in it.
Absolutely. Well, we'll have all of the links in the show notes. And Kim, I want to thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you for joining us today. And don't forget to check out our show notes for details on joining our Facebook group and for following along on Instagram. If you would like a free recurrent pregnancy loss lab checklist, go to miscarriagehopedesk.com/labs. Again, that's miscarriagehopedesk.com/LABS to get your free downloadable checklist. And for even more resources, visit the Miscarriage Hope Desk website, where we have stories of hope plus an entire library of evidence-based research articles related to fertility and miscarriage. If you enjoyed this episode, I would so appreciate it if you rate, reviewed, and subscribed to the Miscarriage Hope Desk podcast. Your ratings and reviews will help others to find us. I want to wrap up by saying that if you are going through a miscarriage, my heart goes out to you, and as difficult as your experience may be, I want you to know that you are not alone and that you will find a path forward.